Welcome to Woodworking Fever More. Today's project, I'm going to be building my wife a brand new office table. This is what it currently looks like, and this is what I'm building her. If this is something you're interested in, follow along. I'll try to do my best to explain how I did it. Alright, so starting out with the build, I'm showing you the finished product of what I was building here. So starting out, I laid out the material onto my table, my workbench, and started to tack weld all of the pieces of metal together. Now I didn't fully weld them, so that way if my design changes or I need to do some tweaks, it's easier to remove the tack welds than full welds. And once I did all the sides, I started to join, especially the one that's going to have the shelf and the drawer. I started to weld it, tack it together and make sure it's square. This one here on the bench is the other leg. It's going to be a single leg. There's just to support the table. Again, I tack weld it. I showed you a little bit more here so that way you can see how I actually had to square it out as well. And then moved on to a top. So I took a 4x8 sheet, I started to break it down and lay it all out in a rough condition, meaning that anytime design changes, I can easily adjust it. And this is where I brought my wife over. I had her sit down because she's the one that's going to be using it, and have her basically feel the table, the height. She works, this is a full-time job for her, and she knows how to sit properly. They had training, and I had to make sure that it fits her needs. And you see me here kind of redoing my work because I actually ended up making it about 10 inches too deep, and it hurt a little because it was a little expensive for the metal, but it's okay. That's what happens. That's why I tack welded everything, so I don't have to go in and start cutting giant welds apart. So 10 inches too much, no big deal. Once I adjusted that, I ended up cutting the second layer of plywood for the top down and glued them together. I put a lot of glue on here because I wanted it to really stick together. I used a putty knife to try to leave a thin layer. Later on, I ended up buying a special putty knife or glue knife where it leaves a little bit of lines like a comb. Didn't use it here, didn't have it yet. Tack nailing it here with a nailing gun is just to hold it in place. The glue is the structure part of that process. Here I'm using hardwood floor pieces that I had left over from my brother's projects. They're Tom and Groove hardwood floor pieces. I ended up planing them. You see me pulling it through the planer. That's because my blade was dull, didn't even realize it. So I only cut off one Tom and Groove on one side and started to cut all my strips. All of them were about half an inch. The hardwood floor were really nice and dry. You can see as soon as they come out the other end of a table saw, they were dry. They started to bend. I didn't realize this until I was watching the footage, but it worked out okay. Here I'm laying out just to see how much I need, just like a rough estimate. It worked out pretty good. Now I'm starting on the sides here. My pieces that I was using are about 3/4 inch wide by 1/2 inch thick. I had to cut one of the pieces down to about 1/4 inch so I can fit it in between, so that way it looks kind of even. Top piece, bottom piece, and then the middle piece is half of the top and bottom piece. I hope that makes sense. As I was putting these pieces together, when one piece and the second layer on top, I had to make sure that overlaps about 3 to 4 inches, so that way the lines are not really close to each other, and then keep doing that with all the pieces. Once I did all the sides, I ended up going in and using a router. So this time you see me kind of trying to go left to right, meaning to go with the spinning to the blades and towards the spinning of the blade. And I started to get chip out because the wood was really dry, so I ended up taking out small layers at a time, going through and routering out all the sides. But once all that was routed out and it was all nice and flush, I started to glue up the top. Now I started to speed this up quite a bit because it's the same repetitive process over and over again. Again, trying to make sure the seams don't match up, that they overlap a few inches of each other. You can see I'm using a rag where I'm wiping away all of the glue, excess glue. My rag being green, I ended up kind of staining it actually a little bit because the towel started to lose its color, and on the right side you can see it's a little green. I ended up sanding all that out. My fingers ended up hurting after this because it was a long process of trying to make sure there's no gaps in between the pieces as well, and I tried using a little bit of a clamps, a little bit forcing it down to the side and then down. I had to put glue not only in the bottom, on sides too, so that way they don't kind of peel open. Using a 23 gauge brad nailer, it was about half an inch nails I was using because a little bit more than half an inch, excuse me. It was about an inch actually. The pieces themselves were half an inch. And I went through and tacked them and tried to make as small gaps as I possibly can. Obviously it didn't work out. Some pieces were smaller, some pieces might have shrank, I'm not sure. But yeah, it was a fun process to do. I was really happy to be done, of course. I left the pieces on the side kind of long, and I ended up using a flush bit router a bit and then going through and slowly cutting it flush. Here I'm kind of showing you a shot, a really good shot from the bottom up, so you can see the router bit. Once I was done there, I started to grab a giant belt sander and just started to rough it out. Once I got a semi-smooth surface, I ended up using 2 orbital sanders at the same time. It helped quite a bit. I ended up using sawdust. I put it in the bag so that way whenever I'm going to be patching the gaps, I can actually use the sawdust with epoxy, and that's what you see me doing here, but square off the edges so that way you don't have rough corners. I kind of regret using epoxy here, mostly because I left it in the sun a little bit to kind of dry, and the epoxy didn't do really good in the heat, and it kind of bubbled up and kind of removed. I wish I would have used regular wood glue mixing with the sawdust, but that's okay, it worked out. Next, I started to weld all of my metal pieces together. Here I'm going to show you a small sample of how I did it. I went through, welded a seam, used a grinder, ground down the welds, and then welded again as soon as there were any kind of gaps, any kind of imperfections. And I kept doing that and kept grinding away until I had a full flat surface. And then I used a little bit of orbital sander to show you what the seam looks like when you were done. After this, I moved on to cutting the flanges where I'm going to attach the tabletop to the metal base. This is the stock flat bar that I measured out and did a little cool trick where I used a knife to cut metal. After I was done with that, I ended up basically making holes in it so that way I can drive the screws in once I weld these flanges up to the metal. Here just me showing you how I did it. I countersunk them so that way they're sitting flush. I used a top of my bench, which is not a very good idea being that it's wood. I ended up tack welding it. I didn't do full welds. This is the piece that's holding the 2 pieces of legs together, the one with on the left to the right, and I ended up grinding the edges over a little too much, that way I can put a little bit of weld in there. This table being that it's so big, I ended up having to not weld the back part in, but actually use a bit that drills a hole out and actually makes thread at the same time. And so that way I can take this table apart anytime I move. I wouldn't be able to even put it through my regular doors. And you'll see me remove it, but more than once on this footage here. Once all that was ready, I took it outside. It was a nice sunny day. I put a giant cloth outside. I ended up driving some pieces of wood wedges into the inside the pieces of legs, so that way it sits up off the ground of the cloth and the grass, and I can actually go through and paint the whole thing. I painted it about 3 times, sanding some areas that needed to be a little bit more smoother, but doing 3 layers, and then after that I ended up doing a clear coat. satin clear coat so that way it's not very shiny. The paint itself is flat as well. Next, I started to break the material down to start building the drawer. The material I'm cutting right now is going to be the outer layer of the drawer, the box itself. The process that I was going through when I was building this drawer was that I ended up using 4 sides of the box, meaning that I had the sides, the back, and the front. And I kept putting it in place like I was going to put it there, like I was going to build it with the front closed, which was a mistake because I ended up making it 3/4 inch deeper. And it kind of looked a little funky, but towards the end it ended up working out. Once I got the box, I ended up countersinking the screws and driving in about 1.5 inch sheetrock screws. Once I was done with that and it was nice and square, I went ahead and started to measure out the width of my drawer. I ended up putting in drawer slides inside and measuring out, so that way I like to measure stuff more visually. After I got my size, I went ahead and started using pocket hole screws and going through and start actually putting together the drawer itself. Once I was done building the drawer, I started to pocket hole screw the bottom of the drawer. I did not use any dados or any rabbets to put the bottom drawer in. I just used regular pocket hole screws. It worked for me. I didn't have the brain power. I was so tired to go and start calculating all that. The pocket hole screws works just fine for it. It's going to be underneath the drawer. Nobody's going to be able to see it anyway. With a little bit of help, I used a clamp and aligned the bottom of the drawer. Once that was good and square, I ended up putting in the face front of the drawer. After I was done aligning, I used DAB Premier Wood Filler to fill in all the gaps and all the screw holes that I put in the side of the drawer. I ended up sanding and then filling in again. Next, I moved to building the shelf on the bottom of the drawer. I broke the material down. I ended up running it about 1/16, a little too much, too big, so that way it can fit in there snug so there's no gaps. Then I painted it about twice, sanding in between so that way it's nice and smooth. And then I took it outside and ended up spray painting the entire drawer. Once it dried, I brought it into the shelf and I countersunk the screws, and I ended up using, I believe, about 1/2 inch countersink screws, driving it straight into the metal using a small washer so it can bite into the side of the plywood. Once I was done with that, I aligned it and installed the bottom shelf. It was a little snug. Good thing it did not chip any of the paint. Trying to use a clamp to put the shelf in place, but it was a little too snug, so I ended up grabbing a hammer and a small plywood block and driving it into place. Then I used an angle iron aluminum and I drilled screws, self-tapping screws into the metal and then regular wood screws down into the plywood. I'm not going to keep anything heavy over there, just a regular printer, but I wanted some more security. Thank you for watching Woodworking Fever and More. On this project, you watched me build my wife an office table, and hopefully I did a really good job of trying to explain and go through the process of what it takes to build an office table. If you have any questions, if something didn't make sense, please leave them in the description down below. If you would like to see what tools I used, there's a list in the description down below. Click on the link, check it out. Help me grow this channel by liking this channel, subscribing to this channel, and sharing it with your friends and giving it a thumbs up. Help me grow this so then I can bring you guys a weekly video on this channel if you are fancying you. Hopefully when my channel pops up and you get a notification that I have a new build, you will click on it and support me. Thanks again.